what's up? It's VJ, the brother from the ancient mother. You are watching The Headspace, Africa's most poignant hip-hop podcast, where we focus on, tell the stories of, and try to dissect what hip-hop means to the continent at large. Now, you're watching a segment that is called the review section. What I do right here is we talk about projects of new and recently of old that have kind of shaken and resonated amongst the market enough for us to talk about them. Now, this project of old, it's throwback. It's going back like 2003 back. That means it's on its what decade?
20th year.
20th year. This project is old enough to be a first-year university student. This project has gone through a lot. South African group by the name of Skwatta Kamp, definitely one of the pioneers and forebearers of South African hip-hop, mainly because they were one of the few acts at the time who deviated from the classically American rapping style of a collective imagination which spoke in the English of the States to a market of Africa, if that makes sense. And I think they turned the tide after their first project, Cut and Join, when they began to realize through the mentorship of Sipho Sithole, one of South Africa's most interesting political and artistic figures, who at that time was also a record executive that helped give Skwatta Kamp the industry capital to begin their flourishing careers. Now, his story and their story intertwine in this beautiful project. You would call it the crescendo of Skwatta Kamp's career, because what this project really did is when they were beginning to get what they had to do. Mkhukhu Funkshen is the name of this album, and for those watching in other parts of the continent, what that loosely translates to is a celebration of the ghetto, because Mkhukhu is the slang word for a shack, a shanty house, whatever you name it, a slum. So what Mkhukhu Funkshen means is a function in the slums, a party in the slums, a celebration in the slums. So this is what the project represented. This was Skwatta Kamp, who they themselves as a group named themselves Skwatta Kamp because, you know, squatter is where people live illegally, and, you know, camping and kind of occupying this kind of previously unattended to place, which was hip-hop, in a way that felt authentically South African. So you could say that their name represented that they were kind of forcing themselves into spaces which were previously occupied by this colonial imagination, and they were breaking down those barriers that still exist, or at least their space claims they still exist in the minds of many an African hip-hop listener. I'm talking to you. Ask yourself, why do you still mimic, mirror, aspire to visions, languages, and ideas which really are about Western values more than they are new understandings of how we can build Africa? And I think this album is one of the foundations that laid the way for a possible decolonizing of hip-hop. How? This project, Mkhukhu Funkshen, does what was basically the early 2000s rap sound, and if you were watching the last kind of Renaissance review or anniversary review that we were doing, it was by another artist of the same ilk called Ammunition, Amu. Now, Amu and Skwatta's albums have this in common. When you listen to them, you can hear they come from the same era because of all the fucking classical music. This was a very interesting time. Like, I guess classical music was all the rage. The violins, it really felt like Africans were trying to reinterpret this quote-unquote European musical historical sound. Because again, when we say classical, don't just think Beethoven. Classical means any music that has historically become monumental to the present moment. So when we say classical music, that includes fucking Rakim and Eric B too. So keep that in mind. But this European classical influence, these violins, were very prevalent in this moment, and you see it in this album as well. You see the rowdy, loudmouth, rebellious hip-hop nature. These were young guys who were still pretty much trying to still have a foot into the cypher, trying to show the fundamental core hip-hop fans that they would never forget their upbringing. But yet again, even on tracks like Get on the Mic and tracks like Skwatta Carnival, you feel this cypher rap energy, but it's done in a way where they had a concerted effort to kind of South Africanize their message. So now they understood how to translate what were previously American inspired archetypes into South African principles. They did this even with their names. Flabbergast became Flabber. Phantom Slicker became, Slick. Who else?
Infa Diesel
just became Infa.
Niche became
Initial M became Niche.
Yes.
They changed their actual whole persona to really gravitate more to the ghettos of their own people. And as a result, they answered the very important question that all rappers must ask themselves: who are you rapping for? And I think it is this album which, more than Cut and Join and even more than Mkhukhu, kind of speaks to a transition where South Africans began to truly fucks with Skwatta Kamp. Because again, the famous hit in this album, Moya, and a lot of us millennials might remember it from our early childhood, but this was an important song because it felt like a synthesis of what we loved when we listened to that grimy hardcore hip-hop and just singing along to Amakwicho and the spirit of political songs in the South African environment. It feels like a song which could have been bred in the streets as people wanted to protest. It feels like a song which could be sang on a cold day with young brothers trying to heat themselves in a drum with fire in the corner while singing their voices out. Moya was the kind of song which spoke to the harmonies of black South African men in the townships, and they added Reload there for that special industry effect, and she amplifies this album in ways that are extremely musical because she was this edge that turned Skwatta Kamp's hyper-masculine voice into something which could sink into the aspect of the general human experience, because Skwatta did tend to speak from the balls a lot. They were rappers who still had that aggressive, fuck all of you rappers kind of narrative, and a lot of the times I felt like Relo centers them among the general populace, and she helped soften the tone of their raps quite naturally, because MCs who come from this ilk of the battle need a way to kind of translate to the greater for of the general public. And I think Relo, as the secret member of Skwatta Kamp, adds this beautiful dimension, and what it does musically is absolutely astounding. The other thing about this project that when you listen to you can't help but admire is the level of experimentation Skwatta were trying to do within certain niche markets. They had a motherfucking rap, like rock song. They were literally trying to cater to the quote-unquote white rock market back then. They were trying to go into the club with Escaleni, Skwatta Kamp, Escaleni. That was all over the radio. They were literally going into the streets with Moya. They were literally telling the stories of street thugs with songs like Danyane. They were going into the heartstrings of people with songs like Story to Tell. They were literally tapping into the underground with songs like Panic. They were, this was an album which they sat down and they said, we don't want to divorce ourselves from our roots as a classical hip-hop group, but we understand that our destiny and our centering is in the country. So if we don't speak to the collective voices and the angst and the pain and the joy and the celebration of South Africans, this album is just gonna become another one of those where South African kids are just trying to do this American fad. But it wasn't, because it spoke to all of that. And I think it still distills itself with as much efficacy as it did back then, because now you listen to it in a way where it's aged in terms of its message. You see how, there's real volatile and immature moments, especially from a lot of the members. I think Skwatta Kamp is one of those groups where the dynamic was more vocal because they had different voices and different flows. You knew who was who, but the content kind of slid between excellent and borderline corny because some of the members weren't good rappers. I mean, Infa has an amazing voice, but a lot of the times his lyrics tended to be lackluster. Monkey see, Infa do, Infa see, Infa fuck. Now, I think it was things like that which were able to kind of sprinkle this album with a little bit of a sludgy feel that doesn't quite make it feel as cohesive. Flaba in many parts of this album becomes the shining, glowing star. He's street, yet ghetto, yet so freaking charismatic. It's undeniable that he was really the centerpiece of Skwatta's lyrical and stylistic arsenal. I got punchlines and all the flavors that they have on it. That's a quote. And he does all of this with such flair that you can't help but understand why his solo career tended to be the most successful. And we all know Slicker became the large business head of Skwatta, and I've always looked at them like Wu-Tang. So if RZA was the head that connected all these members because he understood the business of the game and each member's strength, Slicker really is the RZA of Skwatta Kamp. Not the most talented in the rap, but understood how to put all of this together. And I think today it lives on in the legacy of this kind of Voltron force which comes together, arm, leg, arm, and becomes this powerful godly force that still is Skwatta Kamp, whose legacy we're able to look at positively till this day. What can Mkhukhu Funkshen as an album teach us? Stand strong for your values, because these niggas still kind of rap like thoroughly, but also learn from your surroundings, because they took that and they tried to adapt to the streets, to Igasi. And also, never compromise, English bundles guys, never compromise on the voice of each member. Find a way, especially when you're in a group, to have everybody's voice heard. And Skwatta is magical because as a group they've never really had tiffs and beefs to a point that have broken down the whole structure. I think like all things brotherhood, all things family, things tend to sour, but musically they always gave everybody a chance to shine. You always had your favorite member based on the quality that you appreciate in an artist. And I think ultimately Mkhukhu Funkshen still becomes a celebration for the ghetto, and now we're able to look at it with great reminiscing, nostalgic appeal in hindsight and say that the lessons that we've learned from the past we're still able to replicate in the future. And as I said, those lessons are, don't forget your roots, because Skwatta Kamp never forgot the fact that they were a hardcore hip-hop group, but they found a way to kind of make that work within the industry machine. They found a way to turn great cypher raps into, you know, pretty decent songs. And as a result, as a group, they were able to transcend the cypher. They were able to step into the echelon of great South African acts that have contributed to the culture. In African hip-hop, South African hip-hop. So we say salute. My name is Viwe, the brother from the ancient mother. I don't rate this one because obviously it's a classic and it stood the test of time. But I think the interesting thing is, does it still bang? If you're millennial and you remember where you were when you listened to this and when you first heard it, of course it does. If you're young and you're part of this generation, I don't know, tell me about it. Tell me if this album really kind of tickles your fancy, if you weren't part of the generation which was there to enjoy it while it still had its supremacy. Because a large part of this is the engagement with younger generations. But I do think that it has elements within it that, in terms of the attitude and just the sheer ability and belief in self, could appeal to any generation, because believing in yourself never goes out of style.